They say they choose it for the fragrance, but when we put a bunch of products at blind level and ask them to smell, they don't recognize their own, and they also don't choose their own as number one. They're so influenced by the product name. Fragrances are deeply emotional, personal, and they differ greatly by market. People who live in cold countries, summer is equated with outdoors, fun. So the fragrances associated are like lemon, freshness. Where I grew up, India, summer is associated with the grit and the grime of like being in the heat. So the fragrances are also automatically associated with that.
You guys have created a fragrance language framework. Does it have a meaning? Welcome to the Collaborative Canvas. And this time, I'm shooting out of Singapore. Why? Because MRMW facilitated so many great conversations that one of my team captured certain moments which I love to talk about, and that was more about consumer insights. But guess what? Within consumer insights, there's some certain better things that we saw firsthand, and I thought it would be a great opportunity to get somebody who spoke about fragrances and how the sensory research takes its own shape when you do qualitative or quantitative research, and you understand the consumer more clearer when you do a project with them or when you do a project on them. So I have Ayesha Lulla from Quantum Consumer Solutions, and she's a senior lead, and she presented a case on fragrances, which is more of a story. Welcome, Ayesha, onto the show.
Thank you so much. Thanks so much for having me.
Ayesha, fragrances has been the closest thing to me as well, because I love notes. I understand how fragrances work.
Yeah.
And your case study was a totally different case study. Let's have a little glimpse for the audience.
Sure. So essentially what I presented was a paper called The Fragrance Factor, and it was really about understanding how consumers think about fragrances, how they understand fragrances and their preferences, towards really, creating a more evocative brand mix for brands we work with. And also so that in future, when we innovate, we think about it fragrance first, rather than, fragrance kind of supporting a product that people make, or rather than fragrance kind of being an add-on. And the reason being that, fragrance is something that really enhances an experience, or rather it can either enhance it or change it in any way. Like, I'll give you an example. When you eat food and there's a good fragrance, it immediately makes you hungrier, more curious. You want to eat it, right? It can enhance it. Similarly, if it has a strange pungent smell, you don't want it. It may be the most delicious food. So fragrances, it can really elevate an experience if it's done in a way that resonates with consumers. So that was what my paper was on.
So fragrances are often being considered as more of a subconscious level, right?
Yeah.
So how did you tap into this implicit and explicit combination of both? And then, and considering that, we live in a society which is multicultural, and specifically Southeast Asia market, and that's very diverse. So what were those elements that surprised you?
So fragrance, I think, is one of the most complex senses that we have to talk about and to understand. Like, if you ask someone, how does something taste or how does it look? It's almost easier to describe because there are words we're used to mentioning. Whereas when we think of fragrance, firstly, it's very complicated. There is not like a set of words we generally use. Typically, people would say it's strong or it's light, right? Let's come to the nuances around fragrance. It's also deeply personal and very rooted in culture, as you were saying. So I gave an example at the conference actually of summer season, right? When you think of summer, often people who live in cold countries and have a lot of winter period, for them, summer is equated with outdoors, fun, freshness. So the fragrances associated are like lemon, outside, outdoor drinks, freshness, brightness, all of that. Fragrances associated with that. But let's think about a country like where I grew up, India, where it's quite hot most of the year. Going to work is associated with a bit of the grit and the grime of like being in the heat. So the fragrances are also automatically associated with that, right? And the reason for this is, the culture you live in, the meaning systems you develop around fragrances really influence how you think about it. So to tap that in the various markets of Southeast Asia, we used Quantum's Sensex model.
Okay.
So this is a model created by our partner in Quantum in India. Her name is Anju Joseph. So she created the Sensex model about 20 years ago. And it can be used across any of the senses. You could use it for taste. You could use it for anything. We used it for fragrance. So what this model essentially does is it taps into fragrance at 3 levels. The first level is the very top of mind associations that consumers have. So you know, when you smell something, there are words you use to describe it.
The layman words that come out the first hand.
Exactly. So if I ask you to smell, a beverage, what does it smell like? There will be words that you will commonly use,
like
right?
Sugary or, lemony.
Exactly. Or like smells like cinnamon.
Yes.
Yeah, common things that we know. And also, you would associate it with a certain benefit or attribute. Like if you smell lemon, you'll think it's sour.
Yes.
Right? Whereas if you smell a rose, you'll think it's sweetish.
Yes.
Right? So that's very top of mind, and that's something that is quite easy. So tapping into that first level allows us to see how do consumers very spontaneously relate to and talk about fragrances, and how are they choosing at the top level. But as you're saying, it's subconscious, so we need to go deeper. So there are 2 more levels through which we look at it. The second level is called synesthesia. Synesthesia is essentially the cross-sensory experience we have. So like we were saying, when you smell something, you associate a taste with it. Or if you smell something, you may associate a sight with it. Like, for example, if you smell a salty water, you may think of the beach. If you smell, garam masala, which is curry powder, you may think of a delicious meal, right? So there are those associations that exist. So the second level of that decode is really understanding it through this synesthesia. And the third level is the meaning system, values, and emotions around that fragrance. Now, I imagine one would think it's very difficult how do we articulate that, right? How will the consumer say that? So as I was saying, because it's so personal, we needed to make sure we get those subconscious thoughts of theirs through what we did is different activities, different creative tasks, gave them some stimulus, objects, visuals to actually bring it alive. And we go step by step. So by the end of it, you really go into like the most deepest subconscious thoughts.
It's like you're igniting the thoughts from them?
Exactly. You're kind of guiding them to tell you what they're truly feeling, but they're not able to articulate. Right? So you get 2 things. At one level, you get their vocabulary. At the second level and the third level.
For me, it seems like you're on the sea level.
Yeah.
Then you go to a little deeper, and then you actually go to the deeper.
Exactly. So I think visually I presented it like an iceberg.
Yes.
Top of the iceberg is the top of mind associations.
That's exactly what I was able to recall when you were asking those questions.
Yes, absolutely.
And what is that one thing that you surprised the most?
I think what surprised us the most in these markets in this region, a lot of consumers often say that they choose a product for its fragrance. And we met those consumers, right? Because it's a fragrance study. We wanted to meet consumers who wanted things or chose things fragrance first. Interestingly, when we put a bunch of products at blind level and ask them to smell, they don't recognize their own, and they also don't choose their own as number one. And we saw that across markets. And that's very interesting because they say they choose it for the fragrance, but actually they're so influenced by, what is the product name, what is the benefit name, or even how the fragrance is described. So what that tells us is that probably the language on our products and packs in consumer goods today are speaking a certain language, but what the fragrance is evoking is something slightly different or slightly, maybe it's deeper or maybe it's something different. So that distinction between the two and the impact on consumer, I think that was something that was most interesting.
Exactly, because what you see, you believe.
Yes.
What you smell, you would still, take a second thought when you actually see it.
Yeah.
So if I go somewhere and I smell a perfume, I would still recall, what kind of a perfume I picked that. Unless you give me the bottle and I said, oh yes, this is the perfume.
Yes.
So yes, I think those are 2 things which you also mentioned about, you built a distinctive brand asset. Can you talk through that?
So, using fragrance as a DBA, a distinctive brand asset, it's not something new. A lot of brands, do it. To me, the example that comes to mind, I've experienced this actually, is when you walk into Singapore Airlines plane, there is a certain fragrance. And if you go to their service center, if you go to a lounge, if you go to any physical touch point of Singapore Airlines, there is a fragrance.
Yes.
It's the same fragrance.
Yes.
It's called Batik Flora, if I'm not wrong. And I think they've patented it, trademarked that fragrance as theirs. I read a paper about it which said that consumers do recall, the Singapore Airlines fragrance as some of the assets that they think about when they think of the brand. And actually what it does is it enhances the experience with the brand. Because what they associate is a sense of comfort, a sense of, okay, I know I'm either getting to my destination or I'm getting home, I'm comfortable. And in my own personal experience, I have seen the difference when I go to travel by other airlines, which I do quite often. There is a certain sense, but when I do enter Singapore Airlines plane, I do recognize, yes, I am in Singapore Airlines. And I think that's a very successful case study because it's just a sense of comfort once you enter, like, okay, I know where I am and I know where I'm headed, sort of.
But I think Singapore has created their own culture around fragrances because that's how they've been recalled. And I think that's exactly how brand position themselves when it comes to finding sensory elements or neuro elements. They create some kind of an asset around it so people can easily recognize.
Yeah.
I spoke about cultural nuances.
Yes.
And Indonesia is different than Singapore.
Yes.
Malaysia is different than Vietnam and so Thailand.
Yes.
Every culture plays a powerful role in their own sensory perceptions.
Absolutely.
I think you mentioned about that immersion workshop and the mood board sessions that significantly influences the overall fragrance market in the Southeast Asian market.
Yeah.
So what were the cultural nuances?
Yeah.
How did you ensure that they aligned?
Yeah. All the markets are very different and there is no one way to tackle all the markets. We would find patterns to say that, okay, there are certain things which work across all, but these things are very, very local. So that was one of the big distinctions we needed to make and also communicate that everything would not be able to, be transferable to other markets. But there are certain things where you will see a pattern. For this study and in general, when we use the model, it's very important to question why consumers choose those visuals to bring alive the mood board. Because typically, when you look at a visual without the context of the culture, you may automatically tag your perceptions and your, associations with that visual. Whereas when you look at it in understand it through the context of the consumer or of their culture, it gives you a very deep, meaningful understanding of why, let's say, a consumer in Thailand chooses a visual of a lemon, for example, versus a consumer in Vietnam. And they may be associated with very different things. For example, lemon could be citrus outdoor, or for one person, it could be about like stain removal, because you often get lemon flavored, home cleaning, across all the home cleaning, you get lemon because it cleans quite well. So very different. So one is, while doing the research and analysis, you need to question the consumer why, make sure you understand, and also understand it in the context of the culture. So having also researchers who are able to understand that becomes very important. But at the level of impact, I think what we found is that we created one map per market, I would say, because in each market, the vectors of importance are very different. Vectors of preference are very different, right? So in certain markets, where they had a very sophisticated understanding of fragrance, the way they describe it is very metaphorical or, emotional, versus in certain markets where they're still developing the language, it was much more, I would say, basic as compared to, theirs. So as we looked at markets, we needed to understand what is that underlying language they have that also, driving the way they describe it and therefore impacting preference. So all these things came together to kind of create a story for each market. And then if you take a top view and see, we were kind of able to map that, okay, in a certain market, you can take these fragrances to the next because we are seeing a similar trajectory, versus you cannot take it to another one because we're seeing a completely different trajectory. So if you're going there, you need to speak that language, go for those preferences, etc. So it's not like take a fragrance from here and plug and play. And
every map was different.
Every map was different.
So for every map, there's a different strategy altogether. Even considering that we are talking about lemon.
Yeah. Let's say they would think about a lemon would be different. Whether it's about the intensity or it's about the longevity of the fragrance, those things can be quite different. Yeah.
And that's when you mentioned that you guys have created a fragrance language framework.
Yes.
And that's exactly what it is all about.
So
Or
that,
does it have a deeper meaning?
no, so what the framework is all about, it's multiple things. It starts with, I would say, consumer cohorts. So every brand any and every brand would have a target group that they would go to. Within that, they would have certain cuts and cohorts, etc. So when you target a certain cohort, we need to understand their mindset, their needs, etc. And very interestingly, we found for fragrance, it wasn't just about the functional attributes or the note of the fragrance. It actually delivered some sort of emotional value to them or emotional meaning. Like an association such as it gives me a sense of power, or it gives me a sense of, it makes me feel confident and feminine. So there were certain themes around that. So the first thing we did is actually map that when you're innovating a fragrance, look at your target audience and fully understand them. So we actually gave a list of attributes, needs, etc. that were core to each of the cohorts that we had. That was the first thing, how to think about fragrance. The second is the fragrance needs, which is the themes I was mentioning earlier. So, for each of the markets, then how do you think about those needs? What does this need cohort versus the next need cohort? Then the third thing is about, marketing, etc. So it was like a hot framework that when they would brief the fragrance house, what should they tell them?
And that's how the language framework actually processed.
Yes.
How did this structure, this framework, ensure that it resonated both with the R&D and the marketing team?
So for R&D, the way they actually use it is to brief the fragrance house by saying, we want to create a fragrance and then using evocations that consumers are using. So using the language in each market. So in one market where they are more emotional, using some of those descriptors, meaning that the fragrance should make my consumers feel A, B, C, D. Perhaps think about A, B, C, D. So R&D used it in that way, such that when the fragrance house is creating the fragrance, they have that frame of reference in mind. And then when you're doing the testing with consumers, you're going back to that reference point. For marketing, it's about what do I do on pack? What do I do on communications to make sure that that same fragrance we've briefed about is being communicated on pack.
And so, do they consider those cohorts as well?
Who, marketing?
Yes.
Yes. So typically, the variants are probably, they have a cohort or two in mind. So it's about speaking that language and, giving that. So I'll give you an example where there was a certain product which was about intense clean. What it evoked at a fragrance level was the extreme opposite. It was not at all about that. It was something much more emotional and floral. So when marketing would need to show that, when R&D needs to design, it needs to correlate in terms of what is the function, what is the emotion you're evoking. So that's how the two work together.
And I think that has a lot of depth to it because starting from what consumer not want, but what is consumer, what consumer is actually thinking.
Yes.
And then reaching to a point when the marketing is developing the entire strategies around, if I need these people, I should have this structure.
Yes, absolutely. And if I'm going after this brand versus that brand, I should think about it in a certain way. So, for example, our clients have portfolios with various brands and variants under it. Each variant has a different story to tell. You take any brand, you take a perfume, any perfume brand, they have multiple variants and fragrances. Each one tells a story. So it's also how to map that.
I think that's a very great study. I mean, when it comes to fragrances and understanding that deeper emotions, it becomes evident that, what we are focusing on, we are actually heading to the right trajectory.
Absolutely.
So considering that you've done so well in this whole process in the project, and that was a beautiful case study that you presented.
Thank you.
What, as Ayesha Lulla and Quantum Consumer Solutions, would give one advice when it comes to expanding in the Southeast Asian market and understanding from this whole, branding process and bringing a relevance and a resonance to this diverse region?
So my advice would be actually our learning through this study, which is that fragrances are deeply emotional, personal, and they differ greatly by market. But to understand that, I would advise to really get into the consumer's psyche, understand their needs, understand the needs associated with fragrance and their language, so that when we as brands deliver something to them, we're truly speaking something they understand, they want, and, when they purchase, they will go back to. And I think the way, for me personally, I think about it is going through the 3 levels that we did in the Sensex model was very, very useful, because you not just understand the language at one level, but you understand what they feel, what it means to them. And that actually created something, which deeply resonates with consumers. And I think that would be my advice to brands. And just to keep, to always remember that, each country is very, very different. And even as we try to identify patterns, there will always be a cultural meaning, a cultural value that we do need to.
So, ladies and gentlemen, that brings us to the end of the conversation and a case study that next time when you're coming to these events, you should hear these live case studies where certain experiments being done, certain trajectories have been defined, certain processes have been built up. And at the end, it's a win-win situation for the consumers. So, thank you so much, Ayesha, for bringing this onto the table and giving us an opportunity to talk about this.
Absolutely.
And for the viewers, I mean, if you liked, then I can only request you to subscribe to the video and get more insights from Collaborative Canvas podcast. As we go along, there are many interesting conversations which are lined up, and there's some very surprise elements also waiting for you guys. So do subscribe, like, and do share your comments, because if you have any questions, either of us are happy to answer. And specifically, you have any questions for Ayesha, do let us know. And I'll pass on your questions to Ayesha so that she can reach out to you directly, or you can reach out to her directly by her credentials, which I'll post from the description box. So you can talk to her directly as well if you have any questions. And thank you so much. And until next time, stay curious and stay inspired.